Chapter 10. Owen was sitting at the dining table when Doug sought him out. Doug had grown tired of watching the news reports on Silver and Blue, the names he had given the giant beasts, and wanted, instead, to know about something else, something only Owen could tell him. Owen was looking out the window over the sink, staring at the stormy sky. Doug sat down across from him. "Mind if I ask you something?" he said. Owen shrugged, never breaking his gaze. "Could you tell me about my brother?" Now Owen looked at Doug, a confused expression on his face. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, you lived with him for a while. You have to know something about him." "You lived with him for a lot longer. You should know more than me." Doug nodded. "I feel like I don't know anything about him. I didn't know he was building weapons in his condo. I didn't know he built a robot. He never told me any of this stuff, and I was his brother." Doug had promised himself he wasn't going to cry over this, and right now he wasn't even close to doing so. But he wasn't sure if he'd still be holding up at the end of this conversation. But he had to know more about Daniel. Nothing he'd seen over the past few hours added up to the boy he'd grown up with. "Your brother was incredibly smart, and a hell of a softball player," Owen said with a smile. "Those weapons you mentioned were built to help us fight monsters. He was a monster hunter, and a damn fine one at that." A monster hunter? Never in Doug's wildest dreams had he ever expected Daniel would become something like that. Daniel had always been a geek, constantly taking things apart and putting them back together again. And then Doug, the total opposite, was kissing girls at an early age. "Is it difficult, looking at me?" Doug asked Owen. "You just see Daniel, don't you?" "Not anymore," Owen said. "When I look at his robot, I see Daniel. That's why I call him Daniel." Owen smiled. Doug did not. "Could you do me a favor?" Doug asked. "Don't call that robot Daniel anymore." Owen stopped smiling. "Your brother worked very hard on him. It's his baby. I was thinking it was a good way to honor his memory. Every time you call him that, I'm reminded of the brother who isn't here anymore and will never be here again. You're personifying a machine." Owen sat silent for a moment. Doug was angry, but he couldn't quite grasp with whom he was angry. "Okay, if that's what you want. Why did my brother show up at that house?" Owen thought for a second, as if he were trying to be careful of his answer. "He was following the orb." "Does it bring people back to life?" Doug asked. "Why would someone build something like that?" "I don't think that's what it was built for. I think that was just some weird side effect." "What do you mean?" Doug asked, more curious than angry now. "Jason and Michael wanted to take over the world with this thing." Owen pointed to the backpack in front of him. "And they needed me to power it up for them because, for some reason, I was the only one who knew how to operate it. I just didn't know it. The orb has the power to control people's minds. Your brother died very shortly before the orb started up. I think it somehow reanimated his brain. I felt his head churning back at Les's house. It was still active somehow. I guess the orb can reanimate the recently deceased, but Chris isn't dead. He was bitten by one of those leech monsters. I think the venom running through Chris's veins is what's making him act like this. Whether Jason and Michael know all of this is anyone's guess. I pray they don't, though." "Where do you think they are now?" Doug asked. "Jason and Michael. Probably licking their wounds and biding their time, thinking of ways to get back at me." Owen grinned. "They want the orb back, you think?" "Oh, I'm sure if they're able, they'll try to get it back. I can't let that happen." "And you don't want to give it to the aliens?" Doug guessed. If I knew for a fact that's what they're after, then I'd probably give it to them. There's no telling what they want with it, though. Their intentions could be worse than the brothers. Well, whatever you decide, I'm behind you. Doug looked at the backpack. What else did my brother make? Owen had already showed Doug the busters, so he pulled out the plastic bag full of tracking capsules and the tracker to go with it. Doug took the bag and looked at the pills. How do these work? He asked Owen. I'm still not sure. Owen laughed. I think if they're all together like that, they give off an incredibly strong signal that can be picked up from far away. Chris did a cool thing with the monster where he poured the capsules into the glass of water the thing was drinking. Then we tracked it down from there. Wow, that's pretty genius. Well, Daniel was your brother. Owen nodded absently, remembering. Yeah, Doug said uneasily as he handed the bag back. He was. Oh, Owen suddenly said, and reached into the backpack to retrieve a blue-black ball. This is a rejector. It's awesome. Daniel only made 4, 1 for each of us, but they've come in pretty handy. Doug took it and stared with wonder. It was just like the red ones. He handed it back to Owen, who absently put it in the backpack. Thanks, Owen, Doug said, feeling much better. He got up from the table and went outside through the kitchen door. He stood on the front lawn, looking down at the tiny car at the foot of the driveway. He could see Dee sitting in the passenger seat with a dark blanket covering him. He jogged down the yard and stood next to the car, looking in through the window. It wasn't hard to tell that there was something underneath the blanket, and any other person who walked by would assume it was a person sleeping. Owen had the key, but Doug found the driver's side door unlocked. He slid into the seat and sat next to the robot, pulling the blanket off. He couldn't figure out why he was flicking the switch on Dee's head now. The blue eyes lit up, and the robot turned its head toward him. I'm afraid of robots for the same reason my brother loved them, he whispered to the silent machine. Once, when we were young, we took a science class where we got to dabble in many different areas of technology, including programming and robotics. The class had to pair up, working at different stations that dealt with different things. There had been a station with a robotic arm where the students had to program different actions for it to perform. Daniel had gotten to that station first and had done a great job at it. The next week it was my turn. I tried programming it to pick up a wooden ball from the desk, but I didn't do it right. The arm went all over the place, picking at nothing inches from the ball. Then one attempt went horribly wrong. After I punched in the command, the arm somehow got a hold of my ear and nearly twisted it off. Ever since, I have been afraid of robots of any kind. I even avoid movies with robots and androids and cyborgs, choosing the newest chick flick instead. Dee continued to stare. Hey, Doug said. Can you talk? Dee didn't respond. I guess that's a no, so I'll do all the talking. I don't like robots, and I can't even begin to understand why my brother felt the need to build you. But he was a good guy, and you are his pride and joy. For those reasons alone, I'm going to try to accept you. This doesn't make us friends, though, okay? Dee still didn't respond, but Doug got the impression that he, was listening. Doug was about to cover the robot back up, but then he heard a noise in the distance. He saw something large and silver walking toward him from a few miles away. Silver. Owen, can I talk to you for a second? Owen had been dozing off at the dining table when Vanessa walked into the kitchen. She was standing there with little Sydney in her arms. Sure, Owen said. I'm sorry we're imposing on you guys. We'll leave very soon. Vanessa sat down across from him, where Doug had been sitting minutes earlier, and shook her head.
It's not about that. I want to talk about Cullen. He's taking a nap now, so I figured I'd talk to you while I can. Though how he could sleep with all the things going on is a mystery to me.
She paused, switching Sydney from one arm to the next.
You've known my husband longer than I have, and he used to talk about you a lot when I first met him. You two were best friends?
Yeah, when we were kids.
And you came to live here when your dad died?
Yes, but I can't really remember my time here. Owen didn't like talking about this to a stranger, even if she was his old friend's wife.
Well, Cullen has had a rough childhood. His dad was pretty unstable.
She hesitated again.
He never beat Cullen, or at least that's what Cullen told me, but his dad made living here a nightmare. Always drinking and whatnot. You moving in had probably been the best thing to happen to him. Then you left.
Owen waited while Vanessa switched the baby to the other arm. He was nervous now. He had no idea where this was going.
Cullen was devastated when you left. He started cutting himself. You've probably seen the scars on his arm.
Owen remembered the scars on Cullen's left forearm when he'd been comforting Vanessa earlier. Cullen had done that because of Owen?
He told me all about it after we got married. The reason I'm bringing this up now is I love my husband, and I'm just afraid of what you being here is going to do to him now. I mean, I know he's older and wiser, but deep down he's still a kid, and I love him for that. I just don't want anything bad to happen to my family.
Owen felt awful. He didn't want to hear any of this, but he knew he had to. Why had he left this place to begin with? He couldn't remember. Just like he couldn't remember how his dad had really died. What was wrong with his memories? Is Cullen mad that I'm here? Owen asked Vanessa in a low voice.
No, he's ecstatic. But you're talking about leaving again, and he's not sure when or if he'll ever see you again. I'm just afraid the same thing will happen when you leave. It may not happen right away, but it could happen again.
I'm not going to leave forever, Owen said, though he wasn't sure if he believed that.
There's just something I have to do first. And it has something to do with these monsters running around?
Vanessa asked, shrugging toward the window.
I think so, yes. Then don't tell me that. Tell him.
Just then, Doug came running in through the kitchen door. He looked terrified. Patrick stood on Calhoun Street and stared at his cell phone. He had tried getting a hold of Doug Hudson several times, with no success. Now he wanted to call someone else, because there was no telling when he'd get to go home again. He chose the number from the speed dial and waited. "Hey, Chelsea," he said to his sister when she answered. "What are you up to right now?" "Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Hey, I have a favor to ask. Is there any way you could swing by my apartment and feed my new cat, Toby?" "Yeah, I haven't been home in a while." "Thank you, you're the best." He hung up and looked around. Every officer was on edge. The military was about to get involved in the situation, sending tanks downtown. Patrick didn't like that idea. At least the city was being evacuated. The National Guard was assisting in the evacuation. People were walking in organized lines a block away from the Blue Giant. Lindsay joined him, and they both watched the people go by. One of the reporters from earlier, who apparently had 9 lives, was reporting nearby. He and his cameraman hadn't been crushed by the concrete block after all. "This is crazy," Lindsay said, looking back at the giant. The air, which had been cold earlier, was growing colder by the minute. "What do you think will happen to us?" "Extinction," was all Patrick could say. "Did you know the victims?" Lindsay asked.
I saw the way you were at the Huntington house when they were retrieving the victims from the car.
Yeah, Patrick sighed. I knew the girl. Her name was Alyssa Turner. Lindsay put her hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze.
I'm sorry.
They stared at each other for a while. Nothing more needed to be said. Patrick liked Lindsay, but he didn't think anything could happen between them. He scratched his right leg nervously, noticing the thing in his pocket, the thing he took from the Huntington house that he shouldn't have taken. Just then, a young male officer ran up to them.
I got the results back on those prints we lifted from the Hudson kid,
the officer said.
The prints were abnormal. We couldn't use them.
What do you mean, you couldn't use them? Patrick asked.
The prints weren't like normal prints. Either the assailant did something to his fingerprints, or he was born with funky fingerprints.
Nikki, Allison, and Darlington followed the crowd nervously. As they walked down the street, Nikki decided what she must do. She couldn't stay here. She had to go back to the place she vowed to never return.
Do you have a place to go?
She asked Allison.
Oh, yeah, no worries,
Allison replied kindly.
I have a friend we can stay with.
She admired Nikki. Nikki had helped her avoid a lot of misfortune, with the exception of her last boyfriend, that is.
Darlington and I aren't going with you, Nikki said. We have to go somewhere else. I'm sorry, Allison. We appreciate everything you've done for us, but there's something I have to do first.
Everything that was happening was connected, but she couldn't quite grasp how. There was something, deep down, binding this world together. It was infuriating not being able to figure it out, but Nikki knew the best way to do so would be to know more about herself. She had to go back home, and she was taking Darlington with her. As she crossed the Blue Giant's path, she couldn't shake the feeling it was staring at her and Darlington.